Well, I finished reading the Gurahl Werebear book, and to be quite honest, this is getting quite disheartening at this point. I can't help but be brought back to the last Changing Breeds book I reviewed, which was the Mokole, the reptile, the were-dinosaur book, and how disappointed I was in the writing of that. However, on the flip side of that, the writing is just, it's more about the pleasure of reading through a product, a book. But the actual contents of it, like the actual rules and the lore for the were-dinosaurs, it was exotic, it was different, it was imaginative, it was something new, something fresh, something that gave you kind of a new perspective to the werewolves kind of world of darkness setting, where it didn't feel like you're just playing with werewolves that just happen to look like reptiles. With the Werebears, however, the book isn't terribly written. It's not the same thing as with the Mokole. It's a different kind of bad. It's bad because it's so uninspired, so unimaginative, and so mediocre and unnecessary. I think the word unnecessary is the most definitive description about the Gurahl book. The Werebears themselves are kind of a fun idea as NPCs, and that's how I've used them mostly. But thinking about running an actual campaign of everybody playing Werebears, or one player in the group playing a Werebear, there's almost nothing to give. Let me go back to how the book basically starts. Well, first it starts with a comic book that is again, mediocre. It's not that good. Okay, let's go into the actual text. It starts off like all the books as kind of a personal stories from this protagonist character's point of view of how this world of Werebears is introduced to the reader is the same way it's introduced to the protagonist character of the story. And in this story, it's again a youth who is dreaming about being a bear, and while she's on her university parking lot, her favorite professor is out there changing a tire in his car, and all of a sudden the car slams on top of him, and this protagonist character goes and grabs the car and somehow is able to lift it and blacks out. And when he wakes up, it literally says in the book that my father sat me down and it told me all about how I'm actually a werebear, showed me a map of where the rest of my kind are, and the next morning I was off. Not particularly like, that's paraphrasing, but that's pretty much like how it's depicted. And I was like slamming my hands on my face like, no! There's certain things that I crave for when I'm reading someone's writing. It's just like when you read about the Joker talking somebody into becoming as insane as he is, and they never show what he says to someone to make them successfully mad. You never see what he says to Harley Quinn to make her as insane as she became. It's the same thing with that. How do you write somebody sitting down with their child and telling them, you know, everything you've come to believe about the world and yourself is a lie. You're actually a fucking werebear. It's challenging to write that, and that's why it's intriguing to read. And it's almost insulting to read someone kind of, I don't know, taking the easy way out that way. There's also when she comes across the first bears there, one of the first things they say is like, you've had the shape-shifting 101 dream, right? So I don't need to go into that. It's like, like these like majestic shamanistic nurturers of Mother Earth. You've had your shape-shifting 101 dream, right? Like tubular, like fuck. It really like bugged me out. And when I read on, there was a lot of interesting kind of lore about how their role in the world reflects to the role of the werewolves. See, the werewolves are the warriors of Gaia, and the werebears are the nurturers and the caregivers and the protectors of of nature, of Gaia. And their story is all about this conflict where the Werebears have this gift that the elders of their kind can pull off, where they can actually bring someone back from death. And werewolves demanded that gift be taught to them, and Werebears, knowing the consequences of not being strong enough to actually wield that power, could, bring about all sorts of bane-possessed, undead werewolves that have been resurrected poorly. So they declined that offer, and in retaliation, the werewolves just decided to genocide them all. And all the werebears that were left went to the Umbra and went to umbral dens to hibernate. And there's only 1,000 or so of them in the world today. That are actually that's wrong. It's just a couple of hundred that have risen from their dens and are in the world in the contemporary times actively. And that's pretty much all of the interesting stuff. Everything else is all about how the different tribes that are kind of regional, there's the black bears that are kind of North America here, and then the white man came and destroyed everything they hold dear, and then there's the polar bears there, and everything was fine until the white man came and clubbed all the seals, and now the ice caps are melting, and then there's the grizzly bears until the white man, and then there's the river keepers until the white man came, and it's all so copy-paste. It's just, okay, we have these bear species here. We have black bears, polar bears, grizzly bears, all that. Of course, we have to make tribes out of them. And the tribes themselves aren't that interesting, and they don't really stand out from one another. It's just like if you told someone, oh, you want to play a black bear or a grizzly bear, they pretty much come up with all of the descriptions themselves based off of what bear species they're talking about. So there's really nothing there. In terms of mechanically, how are they different? Well, the werebears are stronger than werewolves, but they don't move in packs. So it's always one werebear against multiple werewolves in those kind of War of Rage scenarios and whatnot. And yeah, they have their own renown, where instead of glory, they have succor. So they value healing and all that. But in the end, as I was reading the book, there's one part that really stuck out to me. And it was a part that kind of read with, why would you like to play a werebear? They're not as glorious and battle hungry as the werewolves. They're not as sensuous as these guys. They're not as politically intrigue filled as these guys. They're not as mystic as these guys. They're not as this. They're not as that. They're not as this. It's like your listing of descriptions of why these are unimaginative and mediocre creatures that just happen to exist in this World of Darkness setting. And the answer they came to as why do you want to play them? Because they're good guys. Everybody is a good guy from their own perspective in the World of Darkness. Of course, you can say that these guys are more objectively good because they don't go around imposing their will with intimidation and violence the way werewolves do or somebody else does, but still, it's too little too late, man. Too little too late. It's a sad state of affairs. It's a sad state of affairs where if a book that you read gives off the vibe that there has to have been some sort of a crunch time or deadline where somebody's okay, you need to write a werebear book, a werefox book, a werelizard book, a werebat book, a were this and that until the end of the year. And you're God damn, just, smoke coming off of your fingertips as you're typing away. It feels so like this was not anybody's passion project. That's what this feels like. It doesn't feel like this was done by an amateur who didn't know what they were doing. This doesn't feel like it was anything of that sort. It's not. It doesn't have the sort of failures technically that the Mokole book had, with all the lexicon terms and all that like spewed everywhere to make it a confusing read. This was simply uninspired. This was simply who gives a fuck. And if you're interested in Werebears, I suppose it's not as insulting, to read in the actual reading of it as the Were Reptile book was, but it's still one of those where if you have the Changing Breeds book that has the shorter version of everything, just go with that. Please, just go with that. When I first bought that and I looked up Werebears, the first thing that stood out to me was, whoa, look at the strength score on their Krynos form. Like, look at how much stronger they are than the werewolves. And on top of that, they're not warriors. Well, if you pick the right tribe or the right auspice, fuck yeah, you're a warrior. So it's like, we gotta know the werewolves aren't nurturers. Well, if you pick the right tribe, you pick the right auspice, you come up with the right kind of personality for a character, hell yeah, you're gonna be a nurturer and a pacifist and a good guy. It's just so... they're NPCs. Use them as NPCs. That's what I do. That's what I recommend everybody do. They're NPCs that have kind of been pushed to, okay, if you want to play them, here you go. The NPC life ain't that bad. Just stick to it.